Hello, and welcome to our presentation on the race to the moon. In my group are me, Anastasia Medrano, Anessa Lara, Nali Salceda, and Amy Pacheco. We will talk about the first successful voyage to the moon completed by Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins during the Apollo Project 11. The race to the moon started in 1961 when President John F. Kennedy set the goal to land a man on the moon and return him back safely. He wished to achieve the goal before the decade was over, which he addressed to Congress on May 25, 1961. The race to the moon was between America and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union launched the first successful spacecraft onto the moon in September of 1959, and it was known as Luna 2. Luna 9 was the first to achieve a controlled soft landing, followed by Luna 10. Kennedy stated in 1962 that whether we like it or not, it was a race and everything we do in space ought to be tied into getting to the moon ahead of the Russians. Before President John F. Kennedy could see his plans take action, he was assassinated at age 46 in the Dealey Plaza in Dallas, Texas on November 22, 1963. Between 1968 and 1962, manned missions to the moon were made by America as part of the Apollo program. Apollo 1 was also known as Apollo Saturn 204. On January 27, 1967, a flash fire swept through the Apollo 1 command module during a launch rehearsal test. The three astronauts named Gus Grissom, who was the crew commander, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee were killed despite the efforts made by NASA to avoid the accident. It took over 18 months and redesigning before NASA sent more men into space. The first manned mission to enter orbit was Apollo 8, and on May 18, 1969, Apollo 10 followed. Apollo 10 lifted off from Kennedy Space Center in Florida, and it was a dress rehearsal for Apollo 11, which was the first mission to successfully land men on the moon. The crew of three astronauts named Thomas Stafford, John Young, and Eugene. Apollo 11 was launched on July 16, 1969 from Cape Kennedy, which is now known as Cape Canaveral in Florida. It is the first successful manned mission to land on the moon and allowed astronauts Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin to take the first steps on the moon. The touchdown on the moon took place as scheduled on July 20, 1969, after 102 hours, 47 minutes, and 11 seconds after the launch. The three astronauts that were aboard Apollo 11 were Neil Armstrong, Michael Collins, and Edwin, also known as Buzz Aldrin Jr. Neil Armstrong was the commander, Buzz Aldrin was the lunar module pilot, and Michael Collins was the command module pilot in Apollo 11. Neil Armstrong was the first to take steps on the moon, and Buzz followed while Michael Collins stayed in the command module. Here you can see actual footage of Apollo 11 launching into the air on July 16th. It took Apollo 11 4 days, 6 hours, and 45 minutes to reach the moon, and it took a total of 8 days to reach the moon and come back to Earth after the launch from Cape Kennedy. The world was in shock and excited to find out whether or not the voyage would be successful. The Apollo 11 ship was separated into the lunar module called the Eagle and the command module known as Columbia. At 1:47 p.m., the lunar module separated from the command module. At 4:17 p.m. is when the Eagle landed on the moon. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were on the Eagle, while Michael Collins remained on the Columbia and orbited the moon while Armstrong and Buzz took the first steps on the moon. On July 20, 1969, at 4:18 p.m., Neil Armstrong reported that the Eagle had landed to Houston as the lunar module landed on the moon's surface at the Sea of Tranquility. He reported that the module had only enough fuel to run for 40 more seconds. At 10:56 p.m., Neil Armstrong stepped out onto the lunar soil and said the words, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." Around 20 minutes later, at 11:15 p.m., Buzz Aldrin joined Armstrong, and they read from a plaque signed by the three crew members and President Nixon that read, "Here men from the planet Earth first set foot upon the moon. July 1969 AD. We came in peace for all mankind." Astronauts Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin spent over 2 hours collecting moon rock samples and data to bring back to Earth. At 1:54 p.m. on July 21st, the Eagle departed from the moon to meet back with the Columbia. At 5:35 p.m., the Eagle docked with the Columbia to prepare for the flight back to Earth. They took about 23 kilograms equaling to 50 pounds of space rock. They brought these samples back to Earth, but what people don't know is what the astronauts took up to space. Buzz Aldrin took bread and wine for communion because he was a religious man. Other items the astronauts brought to space include a falcon feather, pieces of The Wright Flyer also covers pins, 2 golf balls, and a 6-iron club, and a silicone disc of their goodwill messages. After spending 21 hours and 36 minutes on the moon, Apollo 11 departed from the moon and began to travel back to Earth. They traveled around 240,000 miles from the moon to Earth in about 76 hours. Apollo 11 returned to Earth on July 24, 1969. After 8 days, 3 hours, and 18 minutes after the liftoff from Cape Kennedy, the Columbia splashed down at around 12:50 on July 24th into the Pacific Ocean. The astronauts were about 900 miles away from Hawaii when they returned. They had to go into quarantine aboard the USS Hornet when they returned to land. When the crew of Apollo 11 returned, they were quarantined for 21 days from the time the Eagle had left the moon. During the time that they were quarantined, they were checked for any diseases or sicknesses they could have possibly brought back from the moon. On August 10, 1969, the crew was finally released from quarantine. While Apollo 11 was landing on the moon, it was being televised for the world to see. There was an estimated 600 million people around the world that were watching the first successful manned mission to the moon be completed. The world was in awe of the event that changed history forever. Millions were able to witness this huge step forward in technology for America and the world. In 1973, the total cost of the Apollo program reported to Congress was around $25.4 billion. The most expensive parts of the mission were the Apollo spacecrafts that were built because both of the command modules and lunar modules were needed. The Saturn V launch vehicles were also the most expensive parts of the Apollo projects. In today's time, the total cost would have cost about $163 billion. Thank you for listening to our presentation on the race to beat the Soviet Union to the moon. July 20th, 1969 will go down in history forever.